He never imagined that the apex predator he had feared for decades, a creature built for killing, would be the only thing standing between three helpless souls and a violent, bloody death in the snow. The silence in the high mountains of Montana was usually a comfort to Elias Thorne, but tonight, it felt like a judgment. At 74, Elias lived a life stripped to its barest essentials in a cedar cabin that smelled perpetually of wood smoke and old paper. Since his wife, Martha, had passed 5 years ago, the silence had grown heavier, settling into the corners of the room like dust he couldn't sweep away. He was a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice, his days marked only by the rising sun and the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, the only thing in the house he bothered to keep in perfect repair. It was late November, and the first serious blizzard of the season had just finished burying the valley under 3 feet of white powder. The world outside was a monochrome painting of gray twilight and white drifts. Elias sat in his leather armchair, a book resting unread on his knee, staring out the frosted window. He wasn't waiting for anyone. No one came up the logging road this time of year. He was simply waiting for the day to end, just as he had waited for the last 1,000 days to end. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't the howl of the wind, which Elias knew as intimately as an old song. It was a sound that triggered a primal alarm in the reptilian part of his brain, a chaotic, violent cacophony of snarls, yelps, and a deep, guttural roaring that vibrated through the glass of the window. Elias froze. He knew the sounds of the forest. He knew the mating call of the elk, the screech of the owl, and the chattering of squirrels. This was none of those. This was war. Pushing himself up from the chair, his knees popping in protest, Elias grabbed the heavy flashlight from the mantel and the old bolt-action rifle he kept by the door. He didn't load it. He hadn't fired a weapon in 20 years, but the weight of the steel and would gave him a ghost of confidence. He threw on his heavy canvas coat, jammed his feet into icy boots, and opened the heavy oak door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The air was sharp enough to freeze the hairs in his nose instantly. But Elias didn't stop. The noise was louder now, coming from the clearing near the old woodshed, about 50 yards from the porch. He clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, dancing over the snow-laden pine branches until it landed on the source of the chaos. Elias stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in a cloud of white vapor. It was a massacre in motion. A pack of 4 coyotes, lean, desperate, and mangy from the early winter famine, were circling something near the base of the massive oak tree. But they weren't attacking a deer or a rabbit. They were facing off against a mountain lion. She was magnificent and terrifying, a tawny ghost against the snow. But she was in trouble. Blood matted the fur on her left flank, dark and stark against her golden coat. She was cornered, her back pressed against the rough bark of the oak tree. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull, her lips pulled back to reveal ivory fangs that glistened in the flashlight's beam. She swiped the air with a paw the size of a dinner plate, her claws fully extended, keeping the coyotes at bay. Elias watched, paralyzed. Mountain lions were solitary, elusive ghosts. They didn't stand their ground against a pack unless they were trapped. They ran. They climbed. They vanished. Why was she fighting a losing battle? Why didn't she just scramble up the oak tree and leave the coyotes to whatever scrap of meat they were fighting over? Then, the beam of his light shifted slightly, and Elias saw it. Behind the mountain lion, tucked into the V-shape of the tree's roots, was a soggy, cardboard box. It was half-crushed, likely tossed from a moving truck on the main road miles away, only to be dragged here by scavengers or the wind. But the box wasn't empty. From the tattered opening, Elias saw a tiny black-and-white head poke out. Then another. And a third. Puppies. They couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, border collie mixes by the look of them, shivering so violently they looked like vibrating blurs. They were terrified, huddled together in the freezing slush, watching the monsters encircle them. The realization hit Elias like a physical punch to the gut. This mountain lion, an apex predator designed by evolution to kill, was not eating the puppies. She was guarding them. One of the coyotes, a large male with a scarred ear, lunged forward, snapping at the box. The mountain lion didn't flinch. She took the bite on her shoulder, letting out a scream that made Elias's blood run cold, but she used the momentum to slam her heavy paw into the coyote's skull. The impact made a sickening crunch, and the coyote yelped, scrambling backward into the snow, dazed. But the distraction cost her. 2 other coyotes moved in from the sides, tearing at her hind legs. She whirled, a blur of muscle and fury, but she was tiring. Her breath came in ragged gasps that clouded the air. She was bleeding from a dozen wounds now, the snow beneath her turning a horrific shade of crimson. Yet, every time the pack tried to get to the box, she threw her body in the way, a living shield of fur and muscle. She looked at Elias then. For a split second, amidst the violence, her golden eyes locked onto his light. There was no aggression in that look. There was only a desperate, intelligent plea. It was the look of a mother who knew she was dying and was terrified of what would happen to the little ones behind her when she fell. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline that washed away his age and his aches. He wasn't just an old man watching nature take its course. He was a witness to a miracle, and he would be damned if he let it end in slaughter. He raised the rifle, not to shoot, but to terrify. He racked the bolt back, clack clack, a sound that cut through the growls. Then he roared, "Get out! Get away from her!" His voice, unused for so long, cracked and rasped, but it was loud. He charged off the porch, swinging the heavy flashlight like a club. The coyotes, startled by the sudden appearance of a human, hesitated. They were bold with hunger, but the presence of a man, and the bright, blinding beam of light, broke their coordination. Elias reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of rocks he kept for the icy walkway, and hurled them with surprising accuracy. One rock struck the flank of the lead coyote. The pack assessed the situation. They had a wounded mountain lion on one side and a screaming, charging human on the other. Survival instinct trumped hunger. With a final sequence of snarls, the lead coyote turned and bolted into the dark tree lean. The others followed instantly, dissolving into the night like smoke. Suddenly, the clearing was quiet, save for the wind and the ragged, wet breathing of the great cat. Elias stopped 10 feet away, his chest heaving. He gripped the rifle tight, his knuckles white. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold knot of fear. The coyotes were gone, but now he was standing face to face with a 100-pound cougar. "Easy," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." The mountain lion didn't move. She stood over the box, her body swaying slightly. She was in bad shape. Deep gashes crisscrossed her legs and shoulders. Her left eye was swollen shut. She tried to take a step toward Elias, perhaps to warn him back, but her legs gave out. She collapsed into the snow with a heavy thud, her head landing just inches from the cardboard box. Elias waited, expecting her to spring up. She didn't. Her breathing was shallow, bubbling with fluid. Cautiously, moving inch by inch, Elias approached. He kept the light trained on her eyes. The one golden eye that remained open watched him track her, but the pupil was dilated, the fire dimming. She let out a low, rumbling growl, but it lacked heat. It was a warning born of obligation, not strength. "I'm just going to check them," Elias said softly, as if speaking to a frightened child. "I promise." He knelt in the snow, ignoring the icy wetness soaking through his jeans. He reached past the massive, twitching paws of the predator and looked into the box. 3 pairs of terrified eyes looked back. The puppies were soaked, freezing, and huddled into a pile of misery. One of them, the smallest, with a white patch over one eye, let out a high-pitched whine. At the sound, the mountain lion's head jerked up. With a colossal effort, she dragged herself a few inches closer. Elias flinched, pulling his hand back, expecting a bite. But the cat didn't bite. She extended her rough, pink tongue and licked the whining puppy's head. It was a gentle, rhythmic rasp. Scrape, scrape, scrape. She was cleaning them. She was comforting them. Even as her own life leaked out into the snow, her only concern was the trembling creatures in the box. Elias felt tears prick his eyes, hot and sudden. He remembered Martha. He remembered the night she had found a wounded bird and sat up for 2 days straight, feeding it with an eyedropper, telling him that everything deserves a chance to fly, Elias. He looked at the mountain lion. "You're not going to die out here," he told her, his voice firm. "Not after that." Elias knew he couldn't carry her. She was dead weight and pure muscle. He ran back to the shed, his boots slipping on the ice, and grabbed the heavy plastic sled he used for hauling firewood. He grabbed a tarp and some bungee cords. When he returned, the cat's eye was closed. She was unconscious, or close to it. "Forgive me, girl," Elias grunted. "This is going to be undignified." It took every ounce of strength the old man possessed to roll the limp body of the predator onto the tarp, and then onto the sled. She was heavier than she looked, a dense mass of power. He tucked the box of puppies between her front paws, hoping her fading body heat would keep them alive for the short journey. Dragging the sled back to the cabin was a nightmare. The snow was deep, the incline slick. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his lungs burned with the cold air. But he didn't stop. He visualized the coyotes returning. He visualized the puppies freezing to death. He pulled until his muscles screamed. Finally, he reached the porch. He hauled the sled up the stairs, dragged it through the front door, and kicked the heavy oak door shut, locking the blizzard out. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them. Elias collapsed on the floor next to the sled, gasping for air. The fire in the hearth cast a dancing orange glow over the strange tableau in his living room. A lonely old man, a box of abandoned dogs, and a wild mountain lion bleeding onto his rug. Elias lay there for a moment, listening. He heard the crackle of the fire. He heard the wind howling outside, angry at being denied its prize. And then, he heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. A low, vibrating thrum. He sat up. The mountain lion was still unconscious, her breathing rough. But the sound was coming from her chest. It was a purr. A broken, rattling, subconscious purr as the puppies, sensing the warmth, crawled out of the box and burrowed into her thick, damp fur. Elias looked at his hands. They were covered in the cat's blood. He looked at the clock. It was midnight. The day had ended, but for the first time in 5 years, Elias wasn't just waiting for the next one. He had work to do. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and boiled water. He grabbed his first aid kit and the sewing supplies Martha had left in the tin box. "All right," he said to the room, the silence finally broken by a purpose. "Let's see if we can save this family." The cabin smelled of iodine, rubbing alcohol, and the metallic tang of blood. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden floorboards. Elias Thorne's hands, usually steady as stone from a lifetime of chopping wood and fixing engines, were trembling. He knelt beside the sleeping mountain lion, a curved upholstery needle threaded with fishing line in his hand. It was a crude setup, the kind of desperate field medicine he'd read about in old Western novels but never thought he'd have to practice. He had flushed the deep gash on her flank with distilled water and whiskey, and now he had to close it. "Don't you wake up," he whispered, the words barely audible over the wind rattling the window panes. "Please, just stay under." Every time he pushed the needle through the tough, golden hide, the great cat twitched. Her muscles rippled beneath his touch, a reminder of the raw, explosive power lying dormant just inches from his throat. Elias worked with a focus that blurred the edges of his vision. He stitched the skin, his breath hitching every time she let out a low, subconscious growl. The puppies were the only audience. They had eaten a mash of warm water and some canned tuna Elias had sacrificed from his pantry, and now they lay in a heap near the fire, bellies full, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. They seemed to understand the gravity of the ritual. The smallest one, the runt with the white patch, had crawled over and curled up against the mountain lion's uninjured front paw, seeking the comfort of the only mother figure it knew. When the last knot was tied and the wound bandaged with clean strips of an old flannel shirt, Elias sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was exhausted, his body aching in a way that went down to the bone. But he couldn't sleep. Not with a wild predator in his living room. He dragged his armchair closer to the fire, the rifle resting across his lap, and kept watch. The morning sun didn't break, it shattered the gray sky with a brilliance that blinded. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in 4 feet of pristine, diamond-bright snow. Elias must have dozed off, his chin resting on his chest, because the sound of movement jolted him awake. His heart hammered against his ribs as his grip tightened on the rifle. The mountain lion was awake. She had lifted her head, her ears swiveling toward him. The swelling in her eye had gone down enough for her to open it a slit, revealing a sliver of amber gold. She wasn't growling. She wasn't snarling. She was simply watching him. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. This was the moment Elias had feared. The adrenaline of the fight was gone. The pain of her injuries would be sharp. By all laws of nature, she should be terrified, aggressive, and deadly. Elias slowly, deliberately, set the rifle down on the floor. He raised his empty hands, palms open. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. The cat blinked. Her gaze shifted from him to the bandage on her flank, then to the puppies sleeping against her chest. She sniffed the air, smelling the antiseptic, the tuna, and the scent of the man who sat 4 feet away. She made a sound then, a chuffing noise, low in her throat. She nudged the runt with her nose, checking for life, before laying her head back down on her paws. She didn't take her eyes off Elias, but the tension in her shoulders dropped. It was a truce. A silent pact made across the divide of species. "You helped me. I won't kill you." For the next 3 days, the cabin became a world unto itself, suspended in time. The snow drifted high against the door, sealing them in. Elias became a servant to the strange family he had adopted. He named the mountain lion Freya, after the Norse goddess he'd read about in one of Martha's books, beautiful, fierce, and associated with war and death. It fit her. Feeding them was the biggest challenge. Freya was weak, refusing to move from the rug. Elias raided his deep freeze, pulling out venison steaks he had been saving for special occasions. He thawed them by the fire and cut them into strips. The first time he tried to feed her, he used a pair of long barbecue tongs, extending a strip of raw deer meat toward her muzzle. Freya looked at the meat, then at the tongs, then at Elias. With a dignity that made Elias feel foolish, she ignored the tongs, stretched her neck out, and gently took the meat directly from the tool, careful not to let her teeth scrape the metal. By the second day, he was hand-feeding her. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, the plate of meat between them. She would eat, her rough tongue sometimes grazing his fingers, leaving a sandpaper sensation that sent shivers up his arm. She never snapped. She never rushed. She ate with a regal calm, her eyes always tracking the puppies. The puppies, whom Elias had mentally named Ace, Jack, and Pip, the runt, were a chaotic counterpoint to Freya's stoicism. As they regained their strength, they treated the cabin like a jungle gym. They chewed on Elias's boots, tugged at the fringe of the rug, and, most terrifyingly, used Freya as a climbing frame. Elias watched with his breath held as Pip scrambled up Freya's back, digging his tiny, needle-sharp claws into her fur. Any other wild animal would have snapped the puppy's neck in irritation. Freya just let out a long, suffering sigh, closing her eyes as the puppy chewed on her ear. When the play got too rough, she would gently place a massive paw over the puppy, pinning it to the floor until it calmed down. She was disciplining them. She was teaching them. She was raising them. But the idyllic isolation couldn't last. On the 4th night, Freya's condition took a turn. Elias woke to the sound of distress, a high-pitched whining from the puppies. He threw off his quilt and rushed to the living room. Freya was thrashing. Her legs kicked out in spasms, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. Her body was radiating heat that Elias could feel from a foot away. The infection he had feared had set in. Her wounds were angry and red, the skin around the stitches tight. "No, no, no," Elias muttered, panic rising in his chest. "Not now. You don't get to quit now." He didn't have antibiotics. He didn't have a vet. He had snow, aspirin, and stubbornness. He spent the night fighting a war against the fever. He brought buckets of clean snow into the house, packing them in towels and laying them against her burning body. He crushed aspirin into water and used a turkey baster to force it down her throat, dodging the reflex snaps of her jaws. She was delirious. At one point, she snarled at him, a true, wild sound that promised violence. She didn't recognize him. The golden eyes were glazed over, seeing enemies that weren't there. "It's me, Freya," Elias soothed, his hand resting firmly on her neck despite the growls. "It's just Elias. I've got you." He sat with her through the darkest hours, changing the cold compresses, whispering stories to her. Stories about Martha, about the day he built this cabin, about the emptiness he had felt before she crashed into his life. He poured his grief into the fevered air, talking until his voice was hoarse. The puppies, sensing the danger, huddled under Elias's chair, silent and terrified. Around 4 a.m., the fever broke. 1 minute, Freya was panting, her heart racing like a hummingbird's. The next, her breathing deepened and slowed. The heat radiating from her fur began to dissipate. She stopped thrashing. Elias, slumped against the base of the armchair, felt a wet roughness on his hand. He opened his eyes. Freya was looking at him. Her eyes were clear again, the amber burning bright and intelligent. She was licking the hand that had been holding the cold compress against her head. It wasn't just a cleaning lick, it was deliberate. It was an acknowledgement. Elias let out a sob he hadn't known he was holding back. He leaned his head back against the chair, tears tracking through the stubble on his cheeks. "You stubborn girl," he whispered. "You stubborn, beautiful girl." The next morning, the bond had shifted. It wasn't just a truce anymore. It was an alliance. When Elias moved around the kitchen making coffee, Freya's eyes followed him, not with suspicion, but with interest. When he sat in his chair to read, she didn't just stay on the rug. She dragged her body over to lie at his feet, her flank pressed against his heavy boots. The puppies, seeing this, decided that Elias was now part of the pack structure. Ace and Jack curled up on Freya's paws, but Pip, the brave little runt, scrambled up onto Elias's lap, curled into a ball on his knee, and fell asleep. Elias looked down at the small life resting on his leg, then at the massive predator guarding his feet. The silence of the cabin, once an accusatory void, was now filled with the sounds of life, the soft snoring of the dog, the rhythmic breathing of the cat, the crackle of the fire. He realized then that he wasn't just keeping them alive until the snow melted. He wasn't just a way station. He looked at the calendar on the wall. The blizzard had cleared the roads days ago. He could have driven into town. He could have called the ranger station. He could have called animal control to come and take the problem away. But as he stroked the soft fur behind Pip's ears and felt the vibration of Freya's purr through the floorboards, Elias knew he wasn't going to make that call. The world outside could wait. The laws of man could wait. Here, in this cabin, they were writing their own laws. But as Elias looked out the window at the blinding white forest, he caught a glimpse of movement at the tree line. Dark shapes. Watching. Waiting. The coyotes hadn't forgotten. And now that the storm had passed, hunger would bring them back. But this time, they wouldn't just be facing a wounded mother and an old man. They would be facing a pack. Here is Part 3, the final chapter of the story. Part 3, The Guardian's Legacy. The thaw arrived not with a whisper, but with the groan of shifting ice. Weeks had passed since the blizzard, and the mountain air was beginning to carry the faint, sweet scent of pine sap and wet earth. The snow line was retreating, revealing patches of brown grass that had been buried for months. Inside the cabin, the dynamic had shifted into a routine that felt both ancient and fragile. The three puppies, Ace, Jack, and little Pip, were no longer trembling balls of fur. They were growing rapidly, their legs lengthening, their chests broadening, fueled by Elias's venison and the chaotic energy of youth. And Freya was their general. Her recovery had been miraculous. The limp was gone, replaced by the fluid, liquid grace of a predator at the peak of her power. The stitches had dissolved, leaving a jagged scar on her flank that was hidden beneath her thick winter coat. She spent her days pacing the cabin, her golden eyes tracking the puppies as they tumbled over the furniture. She didn't play with them like a dog would, she trained them. She would stalk them from behind the sofa, pouncing with retracted claws to pin them down, teaching them awareness. She would chuff softly when they ventured too close to the fireplace, teaching them boundaries. Elias watched it all from his armchair, a notebook in his lap. He had started writing again, something he hadn't done since Martha died. He documented their habits, the way Freya would groom Pip's ears until they were soaking wet, the way the puppies would pile on top of her to sleep, a tangle of domesticated dog and wild cat. He titled the journal The Winter of the Lion. But as the days grew longer, Elias noticed a change in Freya. She spent more time at the window, her body tense, her tail twitching. She would stand on her hind legs, paws resting on the sill, staring out at the tree line where the shadows deepened. The wild was calling her back. The pact they had made was temporary, bound by the snow and the need for survival. Now that the world was opening up again, the laws of nature were reasserting themselves. And the enemy was waiting. It happened on the night of the new moon, when the valley was pitched in absolute darkness. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so profound it felt heavy. Elias had just put the logs on the fire and turned to head to bed when a sound shattered the peace. It wasn't the chaotic yipping of the first attack. It was a coordinated silence followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the side of the house. Freya was instantly awake. She didn't growl, she hissed, a sound like high-pressure steam escaping a valve. She shot to the door, her hair standing up along her spine in a ridge of aggression. The puppies, sensing the danger, began to bark, high-pitched, frantic alarms. Elias grabbed his rifle. He didn't need to look out the window to know what was happening. The coyotes had returned, but they weren't just scavenging this time. They had waited out the winter, they were hungry, and they knew there were young dogs inside. They were testing the perimeter, scratching at the wood, looking for a weakness in the fortress. Back! Elias shouted at the dogs, cocking the rifle. He threw open the heavy oak door. The scene on the porch was a nightmare. There were 6 of them this time. They were gaunt, their ribs showing through patchy fur, but their eyes burned with desperate starvation. They had surrounded the porch. When the door opened, the pack leader, a massive, scarred beast, lunged for the opening. Elias raised the rifle, but before he could pull the trigger, a golden blur shot past his legs. Freya didn't hesitate. She didn't assess. She launched herself into the night like a missile. She hit the lead sea. Oyot in mid-air, the force of the impact knocking the canine off the porch and into the muddy slush below. The brawl that followed was primal and terrifying. Freya was outnumbered 6-1, but she fought with a fury that defied physics. She was a whirlwind of claws and teeth. She wasn't fighting for territory, she was fighting for her children. Elias stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting his face. He saw a coyote try to flank Freya, snapping at her exposed back legs. Crack! The rifle shot echoed through the valley like thunder. Elias didn't aim to kill, he aimed to end the fight. The bullet struck the dirt inches from the flanking coyote's nose, sending a spray of frozen mud into its eyes. The animal yelped and scrambled back. "Get out!" Elias roared, racking the bolt and firing again into the air. "Get out of here!" The combination of the gunshot and the enraged mountain lion was too much. The pack's discipline shattered. The leader, bleeding from a deep gash on his shoulder where Freya's claws had found purchase, turned and fled. The others followed, dissolving into the black tree-line, their shadows swallowed by the forest. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by the heavy panting of the victors. Freya stood at the edge of the porch, her chest heaving. She was covered in mud and slush, but she was standing tall. She looked back at Elias, then at the 3 puppies who had crowded into the doorway, whining softly. She walked back up the steps, limping slightly on her front paw. She went straight to the puppies. She sniffed each one, checking for injuries, licking their faces to calm them. Only when she was satisfied that they were safe did she lie down on the porch boards, refusing to come back inside the house. Elias sat in the doorway, the rifle across his knees, and kept watch with her until dawn. He knew, with a heavy heart, that this was the end. She had defended the den. She had secured the perimeter. Her job was done. 2 days later, Elias woke to an empty cabin. The sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The puppies were asleep in their basket, a pile of limbs and soft snoring. But the rug in front of the fireplace was empty. Elias felt a hollow ache in his chest, sharp and sudden. He walked to the door and opened it. The mud on the porch bore the distinct heavy prints of a mountain lion, leading down the stairs and straight toward the forest. There was no hesitation in the tracks. They didn't circle back. They moved in a straight, determined line toward the mountains. She hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't looked back. That wasn't the way of the wild. She had healed, she had protected, and now she had returned to the world where she belonged. "Thank you," Elias whispered to the empty tree line. "Thank you, Freya." The months that followed were a blur of green and gold as spring exploded into summer. The puppies grew into dogs, loyal, boisterous, and loving. Pip, the runt, became Elias's shadow, following him everywhere. The silence that had once haunted the cabin was gone forever, replaced by the sounds of a living home. Elias finished his journal. He started fixing the fence. He even drove into town and had coffee with the librarian, telling her the story of the winter ghost. He was living again, truly living, just as he had promised the cat he would. A full year passed. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the sky turns a bruised purple and the air smells of wood smoke. Elias was sitting on the porch, rocking in his chair, with Ace, Jack, and Pip lying at his feet. Suddenly, all three dogs sat up. Their ears pricked forward. They didn't bark. They just watched. Elias followed their gaze to the edge of the forest, where the shadows were lengthening. There, standing on a granite boulder, was Freya. She looked magnificent. Her coat was thick and glossy, her muscles rippling under the skin. She was the queen of the mountain, wild and untouchable. But she wasn't alone. From behind the boulder, two smaller heads popped up. Cubs. They were clumsy replicas of her, spotted and curious, tumbling over each other's paws. Freya let out a low, chuffing sound. The dogs on the porch whined, their tails wagging slowly, recognizing the sound of the mother who had raised them. Pip took a step forward, but Elias placed a gentle hand on the dog's collar. "Stay," Elias murmured. "Let them be." Freya looked at Elias. Across the 100 yards of distance, their eyes met. In that gaze, there was no sentimentality, no human emotion. There was simply recognition. An acknowledgment of a debt paid, a life saved, and a bond that transcended the laws of nature. She watched him for a long moment, ensuring that her old pack, the old man and the strange dogs, were safe. Then she turned to her cubs, nudged them toward the safety of the trees, and vanished into the forest. Elias sat on the porch long after the sun had set, stroking the soft fur of the dog at his knee, smiling into the darkness. He wasn't alone. He would never be alone again. "Come on, boys," Elias said, standing up as the first stars appeared. "Let's go inside. It's time for dinner." The door closed, shutting out the cold, but the warmth inside the cabin burned brighter than it ever had before.